She can't enter unless she covers up, now. Officer Brian Hensley's voice was clipped, smug, and loud enough for the kids near the diving board to stop laughing. Community rules. No exceptions. Even for minors, they called it a dress code. I called it a line crossed. My niece Lacey, 15 and barefoot, clutched a damp towel across her chest. Her suit was a standard one-piece, nothing revealing. Her eyes darted between me and the uniformed man blocking the pool gate. "I'm her guardian," I said, stepping forward. "And unless you're actual law enforcement, you don't get to bark orders at a child." He didn't move. HOA compliance is enforceable within this district. If you've got a problem with that, take it up with the board. I didn't flinch. I don't take it up with boards. I take it up with courtrooms. Federal, if necessary. His smirk faltered just enough to make the swing of power obvious. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. Daniel Greer, I added, civil rights attorney, specializing in juvenile protections. My brother's a family court judge, but today, I'm just a man keeping his promise. The silence held like a held breath. Then the officer stepped back, let her through. This time, I didn't answer. I wrapped my arm around Lacey and walked her straight to the car. She didn't speak during the ride home. Her towel was still clutched like a bandage. I could see the tips of her fingers trembling. When we got back, she went straight to the shower. I sat on the porch swing, the one my sister painted herself, when she still had the strength to hold a brush. Even in the dark, the faded teal stripes whispered of summers, of music, of protection. She joined me later, silent. Her hair was wet and her eyes were red. "He made me stand there while he yelled about modesty," she said finally. "He told the lifeguard to watch until I changed." I turned slowly toward her, keeping my voice steady. "You did nothing wrong." She nodded, but there was no weight in it. She was unraveling quietly on the swing her mother built. That pool pavilion had been sacred ground to us. My sister taught Lacey to swim there. We held her last birthday barbecue there. After she passed, I promised I'd keep Lacey tethered to everything her mother loved, this neighborhood, this porch, that pool. Now it had become a place of shame. "She was watching too," Lacey murmured. "Who?" "Marlene, from the board. She didn't say anything." That landed heavy. I knew Marlene Ortiz, HOA treasurer, a mother herself. Quiet, precise, always uncomfortable during board votes she didn't agree with. "I'm not going back there," Lacey said. I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't making a threat. She was grieving something she'd just lost. I exhaled and stood, walking the towel to the bin at the bottom of the steps. But I didn't drop it in. I folded it once more and set it on the lid, like it mattered, because it did. The issue wasn't just a rule. It wasn't even the man. It was the power they thought they had over our children, and the silence they counted on from us. "Where are you watching from?" I said quietly, staring out at the rows of identical homes and wondering how many parents had stood on porches just like mine, telling themselves it wasn't worth the fight. The letter came the next morning. Glossy envelope, HOA logo, addressed to me, not the household. Inside, a $500 fine for disruptive behavior at a shared amenity, and a highlighted clause citing failure to enforce dress code compliance for minors. No mention of the officer, no acknowledgement of what he did, just the HOA doubling down, as if they thought I'd fold. I poured my coffee and read the fine print 3 times. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th read, I realized this wasn't just bureaucracy, it was strategy. They were trying to make it official before I could challenge the narrative. When Lacey came downstairs, she didn't ask about the letter. She didn't need to. Her eyes lingered on it long enough before she turned away and grabbed an apple from the counter. "I've got online class at 9, she said quietly. I nodded. "You okay?" "I'm fine." She wasn't. But we both let it sit there. I made a few calls after she logged in. 3 neighbors I knew well. One I barely knew, but had seen at every board meeting for the last 2 years. I asked simple questions. Had they ever seen anything strange at the pool? Did their kids ever mention the HOA security being overzealous? The stories didn't take long to surface. A teenage boy was forced to sit out for wearing a swim shirt with a slogan. A girl sent home for having exposed shoulders. One neighbor said her son stopped going altogether after Officer Hensley told him to pull up his trunks like a gentleman. They all used the same phrases when they described it: strict, creepy, too much. But none had filed anything. Most didn't want trouble. A few said they didn't think anyone would care, but someone always cares, eventually. By noon, I'd filled 4 pages with handwritten notes. I sat on the porch, the same swing, watching the HOA maintenance truck roll by, slow as syrup. The driver glanced at my house, didn't wave. I was already thinking 3 moves ahead. They wanted me isolated. They wanted silence. They used their rules like sandbags, to weigh people down until they stopped fighting. But I knew something they didn't. The moment they fined me for what Hensley did, they made it administrative. That opened doors, legal ones. What I needed now was pressure, not on me, on them. Around 3, I headed over to the small park near the south gate, one of the few shared spaces not under direct HOA security presence. I knew the moms would be there, knew they'd talk if the space felt safe. They did. One by one, quiet at first, then louder as they realized I wasn't there to report them. I was there to listen. Officer Hensley told my daughter she looked like she was asking for attention. My son said he waits until the guard isn't looking before he dives in. They won't let my niece in without shorts, even if she's got a full one-piece on. I didn't interrupt. I took notes. And I noticed something else too, Marlene Ortiz, standing near the benches, watching from a distance. She wasn't talking, not yet, but she was there. She'd heard everything. She met my eyes once, and I nodded. She didn't nod back, but she didn't leave either. By sundown, I had 6 testimonies in writing, 1 anonymous, 2 with full names. And I had something more important, a pattern. This wasn't about one incident. It was a policy, unspoken but enforced by a man with a badge and no boundaries. I walked home under the flicker of the HOA street lamps. Every identical house a reminder of how easy it is to get swallowed by compliance, to say nothing, to keep the peace, even when your kids suffer for it. But peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice. And I was done waiting for someone else to deliver it. Tomorrow, I'd find out exactly who hired Hensley, under what authority, and whether he even had the right to detain or confront minors on HOA property. If the board wanted a paper trail, I'd give them one. Only this time, it would lead straight back to them. The next board meeting wasn't scheduled until the following week, but the HOA's glass-paneled office was open daily for resident relations. I knew that because Marlene Ortiz made the schedule herself, color-coded and printed on thick cardstock at every mailbox kiosk. She was there when I walked in, not in the front, but just behind the divider, back straight, eyes fixed on the HOA's spreadsheet of the week. Her fingers hovered stiffly over her keyboard like she didn't want to touch anything. She saw me. Her gaze broke for a second, then returned to the screen. But I caught the flicker, like a pane of glass flexing before a storm. Something was stirring behind her quiet. The receptionist barely looked up. "You here to appeal a violation?" "No," I said. "I'm here for a list of personnel files for all current security contractors, including Officer Brian Hensley." That got Marlene's attention. Her chair didn't move, but her spine straightened like someone pulled a string through her. "You'll need to submit that request in writing," the receptionist said flatly. "I already did," I replied, holding up a dated copy. Under Florida Sunshine Law and the HOA's own charter, Section 7.4, Nonprofit Transparency Clause. Marlene's fingers stopped typing. The receptionist took the paper without a word. "We'll get back to you." I turned and walked out, but not before I saw Marlene's reflection in the framed photo near the door, the one of the board cutting the ribbon at the pool. Her mouth was tight. Her shoulders didn't move. Later that day, I drove to Lacey's school to drop off a lunch she'd forgotten. It was warm, humid, clouds bruising the sky, and the sidewalk outside the main office smelled like wet bark mulch. As I waited for the bell to ring, I heard footsteps approach, heels on concrete. "Daniel." I turned. Marlene. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her blouse was crisp, but her eyes were soft around the edges. Not weak, just tired in the way people are when their conscience stops letting them rest. "I saw your request," she said, voice low. "You're serious?" "I am." She nodded slowly. Her hands tightened around the strap of her purse. "What he did at the pool. I was there, I waited." I didn't agree with it, she said, eyes scanning the ground. I didn't vote for the new code last quarter either. But I didn't stop it. I didn't say anything. Why not? Because Colleen said we needed visual consistency. Because if I raised my hand, I'd be overruled anyway. And I told myself if I kept my head down, I could at least soften things behind the scenes. I watched her, not judging, just listening. She blinked fast. But when I saw her standing there, wrapped in that towel, it didn't feel soft. It felt like complicity. She pulled a folded sheet of paper from her bag. This was from last month's agenda planning session. It didn't make it into the formal notes. I took it carefully, typed lines. One section highlighted in pink. Security should address teen dress code breaches on site immediately. Physical relocation may be used if needed to preserve community standards. I looked up. I didn't write that part, she said quickly, but I didn't delete it either. There it was, the internal struggle, written across every wrinkle in her expression. This wasn't just guilt, it was fear, of retaliation, of exposure, of being the only one to speak. But she had spoken, and that changed everything. Why now? I asked. Because I have a daughter too, she whispered, and she's 13. We stood in silence as the school bell rang, sharp and echoing through the courtyard. Children spilled out of the halls like water breaking a dam. Lacey waved at me from across the lawn, a soft smile I hadn't seen in days playing on her lips. When we got home, I added Marlene's note to the growing folder. I didn't push it, not yet. But I knew where it belonged in the sequence. It was proof, not just of misconduct, but of intent, and intent would matter later. I sat on the porch again as dusk fell, the swing creaking beneath me. The towel was still on the bin lid, folded tight, untouched. Lacey passed behind me on her way to the kitchen. "You're going to fix this, aren't you?" I didn't answer. She didn't need me to. 2 days later, the retaliation started. It began with a courtesy email from the HOA, timestamped 7:04 a.m. Subject line, notice of escalated non-compliance. I opened it while standing at the kitchen counter, coffee still steeping, the sun not even over the oak line. The new violation? Failure to respond respectfully to HOA authority figures, and continued disruption of amenity order. They'd tacked on another $250 fine. The wording was careful, vague enough to avoid legal triggers, pointed enough to feel personal. By the time Lacey walked downstairs, my phone had buzzed twice more. One was a text from my neighbor, Len. His patio extension had suddenly been flagged for a supposed permit violation. The other, from Marlene, "They're moving fast." I didn't approve that notice. Colleen's consolidating votes. The board president, Colleen Merrick. She wasn't just protecting Hensley. She was building a firewall around him. I stepped outside for air and saw the first sign they weren't playing subtle anymore. A uniformed HOA officer, not Hensley, someone new, stood across the street, arms folded, watching our driveway. No clipboard, no notepad, just a presence. It wasn't illegal, but it was intentional. Visual pressure. I took a breath and walked back inside. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the HOA bylaws again, this time not as a neighbor, but as legal counsel preparing for discovery. Section 3.2 stated that all fines must be rooted in a specific documented breach of codified regulation. No clause existed for disruption of order. They were inventing violations now. It meant one thing. They knew I was close to something, and they were hoping to provoke a misstep. But I don't break easy. After lunch, I drove out to the county clerk's office. It was a flat beige building tucked behind a courthouse and a pawn shop, where public records lived in digital purgatory. I filed a Freedom of Information request for Brookhaven Trail's HOA licensing agreements and vendor contracts. The clerk, a sharp-eyed woman named Patrice, raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot of paper you're about to dig into." I smiled. Good thing I like paper. It was slow going. Most of it was vendor payments, landscaping, pool maintenance, mail station upgrades. But then I found the security contract, and my pulse kicked up. The HOA hadn't hired a licensed security firm. They'd contracted an LLC, Merrick Property Compliance Services, owned by none other than Colleen Merrick's cousin. Not a law enforcement agency, not bonded, just a shell company with a title that sounded official. And Brian Hensley, listed as site supervisor. No credentials required, no licensing numbers, just a flat monthly fee and vague scope descriptions like community enforcement and visual deterrence. No wonder they were scrambling. If I exposed this, the liability wouldn't just be moral, it would be financial. The HOA's insurance could revoke coverage if they learned unlicensed personnel were confronting minors. I scanned it all, page by page, and stored the files in a secured drive. Then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Laura Jensen, former colleague, now senior legal advisor with the State Department of Regulatory Oversight. She picked up on the second ring. "I've got something," I said, "and it involves a minor, an HOA, and an unlicensed security contractor operating under a fake compliance umbrella." She didn't ask why I was calling, just said, "Send everything." Now, by nightfall, the report was in motion. Not a lawsuit, not yet. This was higher up, a regulatory investigation that didn't need courtroom drama to start shaking foundations. Lacey watched me from the couch, textbook open in her lap, but eyes flicking to my laptop. "Did they do it again?" she asked quietly. "No," I said, closing the lid. "But they're going to wish they hadn't done it the first time." She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased. Just enough. I stepped outside for a breath of clean air and looked across the street. The HOA officer was gone, but the echo of intimidation still hung over the curb like a shadow waiting for its body. Let them escalate, let them push. They were building their own case, one fine, one silence, one overreach at a time, and I was going to hold the receipts. I met Laura 2 days later at a diner halfway between Brookhaven Trails and the State District office. It was the kind of place where coffee never stopped pouring, and the waitstaff called everyone hon. She picked the booth by the window, already on her second cup when I arrived. "I went through the contract," she said before I'd even sat down. "You weren't exaggerating. Merrick Property Compliance Services isn't even registered with the State Board of Private Security." I slid into the booth across from her. No training, no certification, no liability insurance. And they're sending this guy after kids with a badge he bought online. Laura nodded. That alone could trigger a cease and desist. But the exposure risk to the HOA? That's where things get interesting. She pulled a tablet from her bag and turned it toward me. "You know what this is?" I looked. A map. Our neighborhood. Highlighted lots in yellow. These are the homes insured under the HOA's general liability umbrella. If they are proven to have hired an unlicensed entity to enforce rules, and especially if that entity interacts with minors, coverage could be suspended. And without that coverage, they're wide open to personal lawsuits. One major claim, and they'll be underwater. I didn't need to ask how often this happened. I already knew the numbers. Laura and I used to handle those lawsuits together, back when I was still embedded in the public interest litigation full time. But here's the catch, she continued. State regulators don't open formal investigations just because you send them documents. They need cause, a complaint, and not from you. From a resident? From a parent, she said, of the minor who was affected. I sat back. You want me to file on Lacey's behalf. You're her legal guardian. You've got standing, but I can't touch this unless the complaint is official. If you file, I can activate a preliminary review under Child Public Safety Clause 82. I knew what that clause meant. No public hearings, no courtrooms, just a fast, quiet shutdown. Compliance teams would be at the HOA office within days. Licenses checked, vendor contracts pulled, and the board would never see it coming. I nodded slowly. I'll file. After she left, I stayed in the booth, watching the rain tap the windows like it was testing for cracks. The legal path was clear now, and it was faster than I expected. But the personal part, putting Lacey's name on that form, submitting it to a government agency, it made the air feel heavy. I drove home slowly. The storm had passed, but the streets were still wet, reflecting pieces of the sky and the broken puddles. When I walked in, Lacey was at the kitchen table, headphones on, sketching something in her notebook. She looked up, her pencil pausing mid-line. Was that the lawyer lady? I nodded. She's going to help us. Lacey didn't ask for details. She just nodded and went back to shading the corner of her drawing. Some kind of underwater city. The buildings curved and organic, like coral towers. She said we need to file a complaint, I added. Lacey froze. Only if you're okay with it. She looked at me for a long second. What happens if I don't? Then I keep pushing. But slower, less direct. And he probably stays on the job longer. Her eyes went back to the page. She added another spiral to one of the towers, then set the pencil down. "Do it," she said. "Use my name? You're sure? I don't want to be scared to swim." I nodded quietly. That night, I filled out the form. I didn't make it dramatic. I didn't frame it with rage. Just the facts. A minor confronted by an unlicensed security agent, forced to comply with an unenforceable rule in a public community setting. I attached the violation letters, the contract, the board notes, and Marlene's memo. I submitted it at 10:32 p.m. By morning, I had a confirmation email. The review had been opened, an investigator was being assigned, and the board had no idea the countdown had already begun. The first sign that something had shifted came 2 days later, just after noon. I was working on a case brief in my home office when my email chimed, this time, not from the HOA, but from the Department of Regulatory Oversight. Subject line, preliminary review, initiated CPS Clause 82, investigator assigned. The attached document was formal and tightly worded. The last line caught my attention. All involved parties will be contacted within 5 business days. Do not disclose this review to suspected violators. It was happening. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Outside, the oaks cast long shadows over the street. Across the road, a different security officer, another fresh face, was making the rounds. Clipboard this time, sunglasses, younger but with that same rigid stance, watching everything but seeing nothing. I closed the blinds and turned to the wall where I'd started pinning key pieces together. Photos of the pavilion, copies of the contract, violation letters, timelines. At the center was the HOA hierarchy. Colleen's name in bold at the top. There was still one thing missing. Proof of direct knowledge. It wasn't enough that they'd hired her cousin's firm. I needed to show Colleen, and the board knew about Hensley's lack of credentials and chose to let him interact with minors anyway. That would cement negligence. That night, I called Marlene. She picked up after 2 rings, voice low. "You filed, didn't you?" "Yes." There was a pause. "They're already holding emergency meetings. I wasn't invited. They'll start moving people around. Covering tracks." "I know," she said. "That's why I called you first." She told me there had been an informal email chain between board members weeks before the incident with Lacey. It wasn't included in official minutes, but someone had flagged concerns about Hensley's behavior, comments made during patrols, tone with teens, especially girls. Marlene remembered it clearly because she'd responded with a suggestion for a private review. "Colleen shut it down," she said. "Told us it wasn't the board's responsibility to police attitude. Said we'd lose authority if we questioned our own staff. Do you still have the thread?" I deleted my copy. My stomach sank. But Len might not have. I sat up straighter. "Len, alternate board member. Doesn't say much, but he's old school. Keeps everything, can you ask him? He won't talk to me, but he lives 2 blocks from you. House with the rust-colored mailbox and the front porch garden." I thanked her and ended the call. The next morning, I walked over just after 10. The heat was thick already, buzzing with cicadas. Len's porch was shaded by vines and covered in pots, succulents, tomatoes, something fragrant I couldn't name. He opened the door after a knock and a short delay, peering through the screen with sharp, narrowed eyes. "Daniel Greer," he said. "You know who I am?" "I know what you're doing." "Good," I said. "Then you also know why I'm here." He opened the door fully and stepped aside. Inside, the air was cool, filled with the smell of old books and lemon cleaner. He led me to a cluttered den, opened an ancient laptop, and began typing with 2 fingers. "She told me you'd come," he muttered. "Never trusted that cousin of hers. Looked like a rent-a-cop in high school." A few more clicks, and he found it. An email chain dated 6 weeks prior to the incident. Board members discussing tone, overstepping boundaries, and one line that burned itself into my mind. "We may need to rein Hensley in before someone files a complaint. Marlene Ortiz. Not our job to micromanage paid eyes. Keep order and move forward. Colleen Merrick." Len printed it without being asked. "This stays off my name." "You were never here," I said, folding the paper. As I walked back home, I passed the pool pavilion. It was empty now, a chain-link gate loosely locked. A sign read, "Closed for maintenance." But there was nothing wrong with the pumps, the water, or the filters. The damage had never been physical. It was procedural, and now it was documented. By evening, I'd added Len's email printout to the submission archive. The timeline was complete. They knew. They ignored it. And now the state had what it needed. I glanced at the towel still sitting on the porch bin, folded, untouched. Lacey saw me looking and said nothing. She didn't have to. The email came at 7:06 a.m. sharp. Subject line, "Upcoming HOA security reassessment session. A closed-door meeting. Board members only," the notice read, except this time. It included one more line at the bottom in gray, almost faded. Optional attendance extended to Treasurer Marlene Ortiz. It was a trap, not for her, but for optics. They were pulling her back in to make it seem like the board was united, cooperative, level-headed. They needed her name on record in case investigators asked why the treasurer hadn't been present for any recent decisions. She didn't go. Instead, she knocked on my door at 8:22 a.m., hands clutching a manila folder like it was made of glass. "I'm ready," she said. We sat on the back patio, out of view from the street. The garden around us had started blooming again, pink bursts of lantana curling along the fence line. Lacey was still inside, upstairs. She hadn't spoken much the last couple days. She didn't need to. Her silence was fuel enough. Marlene placed the folder on the table and opened it. "I didn't know what I was looking at until last night," she began. "But once I saw the contract you sent me, I remembered something." Inside were 3 printouts, emails, this time from her personal archive. She'd found them in an old folder titled Draft Notes Legal, the kind of folder you make when you think you might need to protect yourself, but hope you never will. One email stood out. From Colleen Merrick. 2. Board Internal. Subject clarifying compliance jurisdiction. Reminder, Officer Hensley is operating under MP Compliance Services Internal SOPS. If approached by residents regarding his conduct, refer to external dispute form only. Internal evaluation is not advised unless required by a regulatory authority. I read it twice. She told us not to intervene, Marlene said, even if we had concerns. She was already preempting legal exposure, telling us to stay out of it. My hands tightened around the printout. "That's obstruction of oversight," I said, "at minimum." "And proof she knew there were complaints," Marlene nodded. "And here's the worst part." She pulled out one more sheet. A scanned photo, blurry but legible, of a physical checklist from a training orientation signed off by Hensley. No state license ID. No badge registration. Just his name and a scribbled signature beneath the words, "Visual Deterrence and On-Site Discipline." They had him run that orientation in Colleen's garage, she said. I didn't go. But I heard about it. It wasn't professional. It was performative. That sealed it. They weren't just negligent. They'd manufactured authority. They'd built the illusion of power and hoped no one would test it. Marlene sat back, finally breathing. Her shoulders dropped for the first time in weeks. "Why now?" I asked again, though I already knew. She looked toward the porch swing, the one her daughter used to sit on when she visited for study group with Lacey. "Because my daughter starts swim team next season, and if this happened to her, I'd never forgive myself." I folded the documents and slid them into my legal binder without a word. Everything we needed to finalize the exposure had just arrived, from the one person inside who still had a soul left intact. That afternoon, I forwarded the materials to Laura with a message attached. Supplemental witness documentation from HOA treasurer, full knowledge confirmed, internal suppression documented. Her reply came back 3 minutes later. "This accelerates everything." Lacey came outside just as I hit send. Her sketchbook was tucked under her arm, a pencil behind her ear. "Was that her?" she asked. I nodded. "She gave us what we needed." She nodded, eyes flicking toward the street where the HOA security cart usually sat. It wasn't there today. "Do they know yet?" "They will." That night, I watched the neighborhood settle in, sprinklers ticking across lawns, porch lights blinking on like stars waking up. Everyone pretending it was just another Tuesday. But it wasn't. Tomorrow the investigation would move to phase 2. Interviews, walkthroughs, unannounced audits. I didn't know if Colleen was smart enough to see it coming, but Marlene had done her part, and now the system she helped build was about to crack from the inside. By Thursday morning, I had a plan. Not a vague intention, not an emotional drive, a legal, surgical, and fully documented counterstrike. With everything Marlene had provided, plus the state's internal review in motion, it was time to take the offensive, quietly, strategically, and in a way that couldn't be undone. I opened a blank file and titled it Sequence of Exposure, Brookhaven Trails. The goal wasn't just to get Hensley removed, that was already in motion. The real aim was structural collapse. If we proved the board violated the scope of their authority, every policy passed under that fraud became open to challenge. Every fine, every vote, every enforcement. The HOA wasn't just at risk of embarrassment. Laura and I coordinated through secure calls. She walked me through how the CPS Clause 82 team would structure their final recommendation. But she warned me, if we wanted a decisive outcome, we needed public alignment, something undeniable. That's when I made my next move. I sent a request to the Brookhaven Trails community manager to reserve the townhouse event hall for the following Wednesday evening. The location mattered. It wasn't HOA controlled. The hall sat just outside the security gate, technically part of the adjoining subdivision. Neutral ground. The meeting would be private. No camera crews, no threats, just residents, witnesses, and truth. By 3 p.m., I printed a dozen formal invitations. Marlene helped me hand-deliver them, quietly, folded into mail slots, or handed off with brief nods. Each letter outlined the event in neutral language. Community Legal Forum, informational session regarding HOA procedural oversight and child safety protections. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The parents knew. That night, I met with Marlene one last time before things turned public. We sat in her kitchen. It was warm, cluttered, and smelled like toasted almonds. Her daughter was upstairs. Lacey was texting her. Quiet solidarity between kids who understood more than adults gave them credit for. She laid out one final piece I hadn't expected. I found this, she said, pulling out a handwritten log. Colleen used to keep it in the board file drawer. She never shared it digitally. It was a behavioral incident log, notes on community issues the board had deemed sensitive. There were 2 entries tied to Hensley, both written in shorthand. July 3rd, incident at Pavilion W or minor, female. BH said, resolved on site. No further action. August 9th, verbal warning issued dress code pushback. Treasurer objected. No action taken. It wasn't just evidence. It was corroboration. Independent, unprompted, predating everything I had. I looked at her. You realize this takes you out of the shadows. I know, she said, but if the ship's going down, I'd rather be the one who pulled the first nail than the one who stayed silent in the gallery. She smiled, tired and clear-eyed. As I drove home, the neighborhood was unusually quiet. Fewer cars on the streets, no music from the park. Even the security patrol cart was absent. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know how organized it was. When I got home, Lacey was sitting on the porch swing. The folded towel was still there, but she'd rested her sketchbook on top of it like a paperweight. She didn't look up as I approached, just kept shading in the silhouette of a cracked watchtower surrounded by coral. They're starting to talk, I said. Good, she whispered. I looked out at the rows of perfect lawns and polished hedges. But the illusion was thinning. Next week, we'd bring it all into one room. The cover-ups, the contracts, and the people who thought they'd never be held accountable. The day before the meeting, I finalized the preparation phase. Every document, photo, timestamp, and testimony was backed up twice. Once on a secure drive, once in physical binders. Each binder had color-coded tabs. Licensing violations, internal board correspondence, witness statements, retaliatory actions, and security overreach logs. No fluff, just the clean, hard bones of the case. I didn't need theatrics. The truth was loud enough. Marlene dropped off her original incident log in a sealed envelope that morning. She didn't say much, just a nod and a small, weary smile like she'd exhaled something that had sat in her lungs too long. I placed the envelope in the center of the oversight suppression section. It was the missing keystone. The entries were dated, handwritten, and came from inside. That meant the timeline was bulletproof. Around noon, I got a call from Laura. "They've received all supporting materials," she said. "Preliminary findings are enough to justify an in-person audit. They'll enter the HOA office by the end of the week." I asked what that meant, practically. "Means they'll review contracts on site, question board members individually, and freeze any further enforcement actions involving minors until it's resolved. If the board pushes back, they'll be referred to the Attorney General's office." How soon would that become public? Depends. But if you go public tomorrow, we'll be one step ahead. She didn't need to say more. The strategy was clear. Get the neighborhood on record first and let the authorities follow. Flip the court of public opinion before the board could twist the narrative. After we hung up, I stepped outside. It was hot, still. The kind of summer heat that made everything feel like it was holding its breath. Across the street, the security patrol cart was parked again, but no one was in it. Just the clipboard on the seat and a blinking light on the dash. A hollow display. They were watching, but they weren't showing their faces anymore. That evening, I sat down with Lacey. I showed her the binder. "I'm bringing this tomorrow. Not for you to speak, but so you know what we're standing on." She flipped through slowly, careful not to smudge the pages. When she reached the violation letter, her hand hesitated. "This still makes me feel sick." "It should," I said. "They hoped it would make you feel powerless." But it didn't. She didn't answer. But she didn't close the binder either. That night, I printed the agenda for the forum. I didn't list names. I didn't mention the board. If they showed up, they'd know it wasn't for them. I included a fourth line at the bottom, in small, italicized type. For the protection of minors involved, video or audio recordings are not permitted. It wasn't just about protecting Lacey anymore. Other families had started to come forward, some in whispers, some in folded notes left at my door. That night, I stood on the porch again, binder in hand, watching the pool pavilion across the street. The lights were off now, the gate still chained, the silence was complete. But it wouldn't be tomorrow. Tomorrow, voices would fill that event hall, calm, measured, backed by evidence. They wouldn't yell, they wouldn't scream. They would tell the truth, backed by timestamps, signatures, and the reluctant testimony of a board member who'd chosen her daughter's future over the board's protection racket. And I would be ready. Not because I wanted to win, but because I'd promised a woman, my sister, that her daughter would grow up in a place that was safe. And tomorrow, I'd make damn sure that promise meant something. The hall filled slowly. By 6:40 p.m., a few dozen residents had arrived, some still in work clothes, some gripping folded lawn chairs, despite the rows of empty seats inside. There were parents I recognized from park benches and pickup lines, and others I hadn't seen since last year's 4th of July cookout. The silence among them was careful, not tense, just waiting. At 6:57, the final chair scraped back. No sign of Colleen. But I noticed 2 board members in the back row, one whispering to the other. They didn't sign in, didn't take handouts, just observed, eyes narrowed like the walls might betray them. I stood at the front of the hall, a small folding table beside me with the binder closed neatly on top. Nothing projected, no screens, no mic. I didn't need volume, I needed clarity. "Thank you for coming," I began, steady and low. "This isn't a vote. It's not a rebellion. It's an airing of fact. You're here because something crossed a line, and I promised someone I wouldn't let it happen quietly." Heads turned, a few nodded. I opened the binder, then I began. I walked them through the timeline. No dramatics, just dates, times, official language. The violation letters, the unlicensed contract, the behavioral incident log. I quoted Colleen's words from the emails. I showed the orientation notes signed in her cousin's garage. And then I paused. "You may think this only matters to the families involved," I said, flipping to the insurance chart. "But when the HOA hires unlicensed personnel, when they detain minors, when they retaliate through fines and intimidation, every property here becomes a liability." That got attention. Several faces stiffened. One man at the edge of the room leaned forward, eyes fixed on the chart. Another woman pulled out a notepad, started scribbling. I didn't name Lacey, but I told them what was done to her, how she was made to cover up under watch, how Officer Hensley had forced other children into similar confrontations, How those incidents weren't accidents. They were patterns, recorded, ignored, and protected. Then I closed the binder. "I'm not asking you to believe me," I said. "I'm showing you what your board tried to keep hidden. What they buried behind fake titles, fake authority, and the fear that no one would push back." Silence. The kind that weighs heavier than noise. Then, slowly, a woman stood. "My daughter stopped going to the pool last summer," she said. Didn't tell me why. Just said she didn't feel safe anymore. Now I know her voice cracked, but she didn't sit. Another voice joined, an older man who described a warning issued to his teenage grandson for wearing basketball shorts too low while walking from the mailbox to the pool gate. "He was humiliated," he said. "Didn't come out for 2 days." Marlene stepped forward next. She didn't go to the table. She didn't make a speech, just raised her hand from the middle of the crowd. "I was part of the board," she said. "I saw the directives. I didn't stop them. I regret that more than anything someone clapped. Another followed, not applause, a signal, a release." The back row board members stood and left quietly. They didn't look back. By 8 o'clock, the forum had turned into something else. Neighbors connecting lines, realizing the weight of the structure that had been pressing against them. Quiet rules, quiet fines, quiet control, and now, exposure. As the crowd filtered out, one father paused at the door and turned back to me. "I never thought anyone could crack them," he said. "I didn't," I replied. "They did it to themselves." I just held the mirror. He nodded and left. Only Marlene remained behind, folding stray papers and stacking chairs. "You did what none of them expected," she said. "They gave me no choice." Outside, the sky was deep blue and heavy with stars. The air smelled like cut grass and something older, like a page finally turning after sitting too long in the dark. Tomorrow, the regulators would arrive. But tonight, the neighborhood had spoken first. They arrived the next morning at 9:12 a.m. 3 unmarked sedans pulled up in front of the HOA administrative office. Out stepped 4 agents, plainclothes, badges displayed, clipboards in hand. No warning, no ceremony, just execution. By 9:17, the glass door had been propped open, and the first file cabinets were being rolled out onto folding tables in the sun. I watched from across the street, parked just outside the pool gate. The chain was still looped through the latch, the closed for maintenance sign hanging crooked from one zip tie. The irony wasn't lost on me. By 9:45, residents began trickling in. Word had spread fast after last night's forum. Phones buzzed, group chats lit up, and by mid-morning, a slow crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. No shouting, no protest signs. Just neighbors, arms crossed, hands in pockets, watching the fall of a structure that had once loomed over them like a second government. Colleen was the last to arrive. She pulled up in a pearl-white SUV, sharp sunglasses, phone pressed to her ear. Her walk from the car to the door was fast, stiff. Her heels clicked in a pattern too precise to be casual. But she didn't speak to anyone, didn't acknowledge the gathering. An investigator stopped her at the door. She tried to wave him off. That didn't go well. Within seconds, they were pointing at a clipboard. I couldn't hear the exchange, but the posture said everything. Her spine snapped back, chin raised. He stayed calm, flat. Then he handed her a document. She took it with the reluctant grip of someone realizing the rules no longer belonged to her. From across the street, I saw Marlene step out from the crowd. She didn't hesitate. She walked right up to the line of tables, introduced herself, and produced the documents she'd given me 2 days earlier. I had submitted scanned versions. She brought originals. It was a final act of clarity, of refusal to hide. The investigator she spoke to took the papers, nodded, and immediately handed them to a second agent who disappeared inside the building. From that moment, Colleen never re-entered the office. Instead, she stood off to the side, arms folded tightly across her chest, a tight line forming between her brows. I wondered if it was dawning on her yet, that her entire empire had been propped up by borrowed authority and silence. And both were gone now. By noon, 2 news vans arrived. They didn't storm the scene. No reporters shouted questions, just quiet setups, cameras aimed low, catching the slow disassembly of the machine. That's when the questions started, residents calling out, not to the investigators, but to each other. "Did you know they never even voted on the dress code change? My daughter got fined for walking barefoot across the pool deck." What was that about? We've been paying how much a month for them to harass our kids? It spread like a chain reaction, from whispered doubt to vocal revelation. Len showed up too. He didn't say anything to me, but he stood beside Marlene. That was enough, a quiet alliance forming in the open air. At one point, Hensley arrived, late, wearing a polo shirt instead of his usual uniform. But the moment he approached the investigators, one of them handed him a sealed envelope. He didn't open it, he just turned around, jaw locked, and walked back to his truck. By 2 p.m., the crowd began to thin, but the silence left behind was different, lighter, like pressure had been lifted. You could see it in the way people lingered on sidewalks, actually speaking to neighbors they hadn't made eye contact with in months. I stayed until the last table was folded up, until the last file box disappeared into the back of a government vehicle. Then I walked past the pool gate, ran my hand across the rusting latch, and turned toward home. Lacey was sitting on the porch swing when I arrived. Her sketchbook was closed, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't speak, just looked at me and waited. "It's done," I said. She nodded once, then unfolded her towel from the porch bin and laid it out on the steps like it belonged there again. For the first time in weeks, the swing didn't creak when I sat beside her. It held steady. The letter arrived a week later. Official, stamped, final. Termination of authority. Merrick Property Compliance Services is hereby disqualified from operating in any residential enforcement capacity within the state due to verified violations of licensing law and misuse of authority. Below that, another paragraph, shorter but heavier. Brookhaven Trails. HOA Board. President Colleen Merrick has been formally removed from her role pending further administrative review. New elections are recommended under oversight supervision. I read it twice. Then I placed it in the center of the kitchen table and called Lacey down. She didn't rush. She walked like someone who already knew. "Is it real?" she asked. "It's real." She sat across from me, fingertips brushing the edge of the paper. Her shoulders were straighter than I'd seen them in weeks. No hesitation in her eyes, no flinch when the name Hensley was mentioned now. She'd returned to her own skin. Later that afternoon, we walked to the pool together. The gate was unlocked. The sign had been replaced. No more closed for maintenance. Now it read, "Welcome, Brookhaven Trails Community Pool. All residents welcome. Discrimination-free zone." It was quiet, weekday lull, but 2 kids were already splashing at the shallow end, and a dad sat nearby, reading on the bench that used to be guarded like a checkpoint. Lacey didn't hesitate. She kicked off her sandals and walked straight to the edge. She didn't jump in. She sat, let her feet ease into the water, stayed there a moment, still and whole. When she turned back toward me, I nodded once and found the bench her mother used to love, far corner beneath the jacaranda tree. That spot had always been hers. Now it was Lacey's. I didn't need to say anything. The swing back home would creak again in time, and the towel on the porch could finally be washed, not preserved like a crime scene. The weight that hung over this place had been lifted, but more than that, others had noticed. Within days, a quiet movement had started. Neighbors who never showed up to meetings before were talking about running. The couple at the far end of the cul-de-sac started a petition to eliminate punitive fines altogether. The mom who once whispered about just following the rules was now organizing a transparency subcommittee. Change didn't shout in Brookhaven Trails. It moved like roots, quiet, steady, inevitable. Marlene stepped down from the board on her own. She didn't disappear. She started a mentorship group for teens in the neighborhood. Her daughter and Lacey became inseparable after that. They drew comics together, made playlists they never let me hear, and walked home from the pool like nothing had ever touched them. But I knew better. Something had touched them, and it hadn't broken them. It had taught them to look people in the eye and recognize what silence costs. One evening, just before school started, Lacey handed me a new drawing. It showed the pool pavilion, but changed. The shadows were gone. The trees were in bloom. On the steps sat a folded towel, and beside it, a girl in mid-dive, just leaving the ledge. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. I framed it and placed it near the porch swing. Some promises don't need monuments. They just need to be kept. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. You're not alone, and you never have to be silent again.